Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us so much. We are here this morning to talk about, I'm going to say good this morning because it is morning for me. We are here to talk about building a grassroots network of peace builders. And to do that, we're going to be highlighting good friend and partner organization of Telos's, the Alliance for Middle East Peace, or ALLMEP. My name is Teresa Casali, and I am Advocacy Director for MENA's List, but also a Telos friend and alum. And to get into building a grassroots network of peace builders, we're going to be talking about how the Alliance for Middle East Peace recently had a major success of passing the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, a historic piece of legislation that came in just under the wire of the last Congress, but took years of building support and advocacy to really have this momentous moment of success. So to do that, we have a fantastic panel. We have Kevin Rachlin, Avi Meyerstein, and Andy Braner, and they are all really great friends of Telos and have fantastic experience to talk about and what it took to pass this enormous piece of legislation and how it's going to help build grassroots peace builders around the world. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them to each introduce themselves, and then we will dive into some really great conversation. Kevin, let's start with you.
Happy to. So hi, my name is Kevin Racklin. I am the U.S. Director for the Alliance for Middle East Peace, and I am based in the Washington, D.C. metro area.
Avi.
Hi, everyone. I'm Avi Meyerstein. I'm the founder and president of ALLMEP. I've been working on these issues for the last 17 years and pleased to have been doing so with Telos all this time, and really glad to be here. Appreciate the invite.
And hello, everyone. My name is Andy Braner. I'm currently the Chief of Staff for Congressman Jeff Fortenberry. And so we've been actively pursuing this legislation for many years, and I'm excited to be here with Telos.
Wonderful. And it's really great to have you three. There were so many aspects that came together to make this piece of legislation possible. We were talking about it just a little bit before we signed on, and I'm really excited to get into the history of that, how it happened, the importance of it going forward. But let's start a little bit with the Alliance for Middle East Peace itself. So Kevin, I'll start with you. Give us the story of Alliance for Middle East Peace. What is it that you all do? What is the work? And give us a picture of where we're starting here.
Thanks so much, and I really appreciate that. It's funny for me to have to do this when our founder is on the call as well. So I'm going to do a little, and then I'm actually going to punt a bit to Avi, because I think it's only fair that as the person who created ALLMEP, it's important to talk about. But I think just to give everyone a broad overview of ALLMEP, of what we do and who we are. So the Alliance for Middle East Peace is a group of, now I can actually say this officially, 132 member organizations operating inside Israel and inside Palestine, dedicated to peace, people-to-people reconciliation and peace building, and strengthening civil society within Israel and Palestine. Our members, I should say, operate in kind of two distinct sectors. The first is called Shared Society, which is within the 1967 Green Lines and building a more heterogeneous Israeli society, bringing together Israeli Jews, Israeli Palestinians together into those types of programmings. And then another component of our sector is called the cross-border organizations, which is exactly what it sounds like. These are the organizations that operate across the Green Line, and these are between Israelis and Palestinians. Bring them together. They can be doing things more like coexistence work, civil society building work within the West Bank and Gaza, or even environmental and climate change activity, depending on the organization and what their mode of theory of change is. In terms of the work that we actually do, we operate as I think some people know, in kind of three distinct ways. We have offices both in the U.S., in France, as well as in Israel and in Palestine. So in Dura, Ramallah, and Hod HaSharon, which is outside of Tel Aviv. And in the region, we bring our members together. We do shared skill building. We do capacity building for our membership to kind of elevate the field and make them stronger as a whole, making sure that they actually have an opportunity to work together in a much more comprehensive way and under a single banner versus as individuals, which is, I think, really critically important when we're talking about coalition work. Internationally, both myself and our colleagues in Europe, we basically try to bring the voice of the people-to-people sector to the public into areas where people don't know what is actually happening on the ground in Israel and Palestine. So for me, I operate mainly in the DC metro area. I advocate towards Congress and to the administration, as well as to various other organizations, be it in the pro-Israel space, the religious space, or just anywhere to kind of elevate the voice of the people-to-people and peace-building sector within the United States. And my colleague in Europe does the exact same thing to the European audiences, to kind of elevate that voice of what our members do and what they are and why it's so critical. And particularly when you hear so many, I don't want to say negative things, but so many negative stories that are coming out of the region, be it on annexation, violence, et cetera, et cetera. Not a lot of people understand or know that there are people who are actually putting their lives on the line and really pushing forward this idea of peace building and what that means. And the final thing, and I'm going to kick this to Avi now, talk a little bit more about this, because I think this is something that we do a lot, is this idea of scale. How do we dramatically scale up the sector? And how do, when we look at what's happening on the ground right now and the youth attitudes that are changing, that there's this idea that we are fighting a losing battle on attitude. So how do we take the work that our members are doing and scale that up? And for that, I'm actually going to kick it off to Avi, who's our founder and president of our board.
Thank you, Kevin. Well, just to touch on scale, I mean, one of the things that happened when we started working with a bunch of these organizations is we discovered first how disconnected they were from each other. They didn't even know that each other existed. We did a big manhunt in 2004 and we could only come up with a dozen. There were many more out there, but they didn't know each other. And so we didn't set out necessarily to build a network, but we very quickly learned that that's a big piece of the puzzle. And when you think about scale, think about trying to touch a significant critical mass of the people who are right now touched by the conflict, by the negative messages they see in the media. I mean, everyone who lives in Israel, Palestine is impacted by the negative aspects. And so we think about how many of those people do we need to figure out a way to touch one way or another. It may not be directly in a program. It might be because they have a family member there. It might be because they see a news story or a testimonial of someone who's been through it. But those encounters have a huge and powerful impact on people's attitudes and their lives. And so, we've now got scale of thousands, tens of thousands of people at any one moment, which is fantastic because they're really going deep. But we need to take that way more and way deeper because the conflict touches everyone. And we really need to hit, some people who study conflict resolution theory say you need 25%. If you touch 25%, then maybe you can start to change the public conversation. So we're really thinking at that grand level as we look toward where the new funding that we're going to talk about, I'm sure, is headed.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, both. And this is a really important conversation, just following up of a conversation that happened last week where we had one of your members, Hands of Peace, on to discuss a little bit more of their work at the more detailed level. And we're already picking up on a theme here of the fact that the big picture often seems so looming and so heavy and so dark, and like we're fighting a losing battle sometimes. But down here at the grassroots level, these organizations that are not necessarily always so connected to each other are doing some of the most important work. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how you feel like that network that you're growing is really pushing them in the right direction to scale? And Avi or Kevin, this is for either of you.
Okay, I'll give it my best shot. So, one of the things that's really cool about Allmap from the beginning is we're really scrappy and we put in an ounce of effort and we end up with a pound of impact. And it runs through everything we do. It's the fact that, we do our work on Capitol Hill, working with people like Congressman Fortenberry and Andy and all of them. And from the effort we put in, we end up with millions of dollars that go into the field. And it also means that when we invest in the network, we're helping them expand their impact. We're helping amplify their voices. So you talked about Hands of Peace. I mean, telling their stories, helping them reach more people, that has impact beyond just the people who participate. We're doing things now. We have a new program to build the capacities of members. There's some members who they've been around long enough that they're poised for growth. They're really poised to go into that next stage. And actually, we think of some of them as being perhaps the potential forefront of leaders who could really absorb and do great things with scaled up funding. And so we've got a program that's in the works right now. It's going to be launching imminently with a cohort of about a dozen organizations. And the idea is they're going to be in an intensive workshop. They're committing staff time from their organization's professionals so they can learn from world leading experts about how do you scale up? How do you professionalize? How do you run the show in the best possible way so you get the most out of it? And by building their capacity, by building that infrastructure, they can then do so much more with the same amount and even greater with increased scale. So we're doing things like that. We just launched a storytelling project that helps gives a platform for program participants to tell their stories, because again, it's one thing if you can get people in the room. You can only get so many people in the room, certainly in person, but just hearing the stories, I think of like the parent circle. You hear the stories of these families who've lost family members talking about how they turn toward each other in reconciliation and pushing for peace rather than revenge and perpetuating a cycle of violence. I mean, you can't not be touched by that. You can't not be affected, and it works on the ground with real people. So we help amplify their voices, and we bring them together. We have an alumni leadership forum so that Kevin's nodding, so I know I'm doing okay.
No. I was gonna jump in on that, but no, by all means, keep going.
Go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, like, just kind of building on the idea of the capacity building arm of what we're trying to do in the region. That first foray for us was this idea that there's so many of our members who operate that, they have people that go through the program and then the program ends and then their participation in the field ends. And for us, it was seen as a lost opportunity for all these people who have been engaging in these programs for sometimes years, and then just all of a sudden being kind of, in some cases, aging out. In some ways, just the program itself ends. And so there was a question of how do you deal with these alumni and how do you bring them back into the fold? And so it took a concerted effort to create what we call it ALF for short, but the Alumni Leadership Forum, to basically bring a cohort of our membership together to get them to understand the power that the alumni that go through these type of programs, the power that they actually have, and how to utilize them as not only as individual organizations, their individual lists of alumni, which I think a lot, with everyone else, when you're talking about individual organizations, they're very possessive over those lists, but also to see them as a cohort, that it's a shared resource that everyone should be looking at and how to use, because a lot of these people, if they go from, let's say, the Seeds of Peace camp, I'm just using this as an example, can they graduate into Sakui in terms of the next thing? Like, how do we chart a path for them and how do we keep them moving through the different organizations, while at the same time letting everyone know that these are people that we should be continuously engaging, and more importantly, that not only Allmap but our members engage them, put resources towards keeping them engaged.
Well, and this is the community, right? We talk about how we're building a constituency for peace. We're really activating a constituency for peace. We're helping people see and in real life daily work feel like they have a partner for peace, which makes them feel hopeful, which makes them feel supportive. That's human capital we're investing in, as our former director Joel Brown would like to say. We're investing in that human capital. We need to nurture that investment. We need to make sure that it's growing. And so you connect all these 1,000 points of light, and all of a sudden you have a real constituency and one day hopefully a movement. And so the Alumni Leadership Forum connects both at that organization level, but then eventually at the bigger picture level.
That is wonderful. That is so wonderful. Thank you for painting that picture for us. And Avi, I'm going to come back to you and talk about the founding idea of Allmap in just a second. But Kevin, we also want to know a little bit about your journey. You have experience being a lobbyist on some of these issues that goes back quite a few years. But how did you get involved with Allmap?
So it was it actually kind of mirrors the journey that I took. So when I moved to DC, I was never supposed to be an advocate. I was always supposed to be doing the development humanitarian work. That's what I wanted to do. And I fell into this kind of this world and found out that I loved it. So when I started, I worked for the Chicago Federation, originally the Chicago Jewish Federation, and then went into J Street as one of their original lobbyists for almost 7 years, and did that work from 2010 to 2016, which was amazing. It's what I loved every moment of it. But there comes a point where it became very tiring, and that's just the nature of working on this conflict. And I say that with is literally sitting here talking to you now 4 years later after I left. So something clearly changed, and what changed actually was I had the opportunity to go into the development and humanitarian sector, first working for the Basic Education Coalition and advocating with them towards greater global education resources, but then to Interaction, which is the largest NGO that convenes development and humanitarian organizations here in the States. It's something like 225 members. And what I found, a couple of things. One, I really thought it was fascinating to kind of see how the development and humanitarian community worked. And two, I somehow kept gravitating back to Israel-Palestine as much as I tried to run away from it. And I did try to run away from it quite a bit, just because I didn't want to get engaged, and I knew it would just make me angry. But what ended up happening was that I kept on coming back into the space and kept on like slowly dipping my toe back in, to a point where, you know, there was an opportunity to potentially, you know, I had heard that you know, Joel was getting ready to leave, and there was a chance to do this. And I had heard of Allmap in passing back in the old days, and I was also a board member for Kids for Peace, which was a prominent Allmap organization as well. So I knew about the peace building sector, I knew about the peace building field and what that meant, but I didn't really know as much about Allmap. And when I started to dig in, I found it kind of very liberating in many ways. The idea that you could be apolitical, that you can take this work that's actually happening on the ground, that's tangible, that really does make an impact to people. And it excited me again in a way that I haven't felt excited about the issue in quite some time. And it was just kind of a confluence of everything kind of coming together at once that I came into Allmap. It was right moment, right time, but also since I've been here, I would be remiss to say that I've learned more about what's happening on the ground in the region simply by virtue of working with our members and working with people like our regional director Huda, who's out of Dora, which is, you know, really kind of tremendous and kind of gives you the energy you need to keep engaging on this issue in a positive way. Not to mention working with people in the community, both in the pro-Israel community, but also on Capitol Hill, folks like Andy and his colleague Ren over in Congressman Fortenberry's office, who really are passionate about this, and it comes out in the work and in the way they talk about it. And so that kind of gives you motivation to keep engaging on this, despite the fact that when we look at what's happening out there, it can be very depressing, and it kind of gives you that kick to kind of say, no, this is actually worthwhile. This keeps you excited. So that's, you know, for me, this was coming to Allmap was a re-engaging on the issue in a much more robust way. And frankly, it's been very exciting. And I would be also lying if I didn't say it was exhausting as well. But also very.
I think that resonates. I think that resonates with quite a few of us. Absolutely. And the part about keep returning to the work over and over, even when we try to escape it, somehow it finds us. Before we get to the legislation and the Hill, and thanks for your patience, Andy, I do want to ask you the same question, Avi, is in terms of like the founding of Allmap and your journey. If you give us just a brief glimpse into that, and then we'll dive into the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act.
Sure. Well, it's a bit of a selfish story as I see it, because I was looking for a way to do anything positive about this conflict. Living in the diaspora, you know, I grew up in a traditional Jewish home, and it was very pro-Israel right down to the sleepaway summer camp. Eventually, I went to study the conflict in more depth and met people from a very different perspective, and so I came to understand a little bit more nuance to the situation. And then found myself watching the second Intifada on TV and feeling like I'm watching people kill each other, essentially cousins killing each other, my cousins, all of them, and that there's nothing I can do about it. And that just seemed insane. And I knew from watching my diaspora community and others that some people felt like you could sit on the sidelines. And I really felt like there's no sidelines. I mean, you're either helping or you're hurting. And so I knew of a few organizations. It seemed to me that the logjam every time was, no matter how much negotiating you would do, no matter how far you got, at the end of the day, the politicians were never going to sign a deal and implement it if they looked behind their backs and they didn't see anyone standing there supporting them. And so I felt like if we could just give a boost to some of these efforts that were going on, I didn't know how many there were at the time, that we could really make a difference on that. And the news cycle, the instancy with which everybody fixates on the tiniest little things. You spend so much time negotiating about who's going to sit where around the negotiating table. And we were spending no time investing in the long term. How do you change the environment that they're negotiating in so that they feel like there's support for the right answers? And so, I reached out to a few groups. I said, hey, I'm at this big fancy law firm. Maybe I can help you out somehow. They didn't really believe me. They didn't understand, what the sort of very Middle Eastern response, or like, what's the catch? It was a pro bono thing all along, always has been. And before we knew it, we had a dozen groups sitting on Capitol Hill doing a falafel lunch for 300 staffers and members. And then we said, hey, this is working. I mean, the people in DC were amazed because they had no idea this stuff was going on, certainly not at that level. The people in the region felt like they suddenly had a whole support network because they didn't know all these other orgs were out there. And they felt really empowered telling their stories in Washington. And it all just kind of went from there. And I think, again, going back to the selfish, reasons for it, Telos is a great example of diaspora communities that want to engage in a positive way. And so I'm just thrilled that organizations like Telos and Allmap are out there so that people in the United States, as an example, can plug in and support people on the ground who, as Kevin indicated, are doing the most incredible things, the hardest things. I feel like the least we can do is to support them from here.
And so I'm assuming that at some point you realized that these organizations, in order to scale, needed funding commitments, and that your idea for the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act was born in some of that need. But can you tell us a little bit more about that? Introduce us to the legislation and tell us what it does.
So right at the very beginning, after our initial meeting, I put together two proposals and delivered them to these organizations at the same time. One said, let's create a coalition. That became Allmap. The second was, we looked at the history, we looked at what was out there, and we saw the International Fund for Ireland, which sort of stood out among the crowd as this incredibly successful effort where many countries got together. The United States took a leadership role and invested directly $1.5 billion. And actually, because it was leveraged so much by bringing other money, it ended up being $2.4 billion over 3 decades. But they started that in the 1980s when that conflict was still very hot and there was no resolution in sight. And they invested deeply in the grassroots. It was a lot of joint economic projects, a lot of initiatives aimed at reconciliation, so that you're creating the conditions in which people will be willing to trust each other, in which you're breaking stereotypes, you're connecting people's daily lives. As we know in these conflicts, it's sometimes ironic because people are getting hurt, they're hurting each other, and yet, other than the violence, they're sort of completely separate. And so the IFI, the International Fund for Ireland, really addressed this stuff, and they invested so deeply in those first 12 years that then you had the Good Friday Accords. And then coming out of that, you had times where the peace seemed like it might be a little shaky, but it stood. People got in the streets and marched in support of keeping the peace because they had planted the seeds so deeply. And so we looked at that example and we said, let's create a fund like that for the Middle East. The world has never, the United States has never invested in that way. We've only invested in the two sides, so to speak. We support Israel's defense. Eventually, the United States supported the Palestinians, the Europeans as well. But it was all about separate entities, never about how we bring the people together. And so in 2009, we launched a public campaign to really create that. And, we were talking before this thing started about how you feel like you've arrived. And so there were so many moments when we thought we had made it, and we had this big public event in DC. And the Fund for Ireland folks came and they told us how we were going to succeed. And we had all the ambassadors from Israel and the Palestinians and the Egyptians and the Jordanians all came together. And that same week, I think, the first legislation dropped to create this international fund in Congress. And we didn't quite make it. And the next year we got the Israelis and Palestinians, the prime minister's offices, to say that this was great, and we thought we had clinched it, and not quite. And it continued like that for many years, and we just kept at it, and we eventually grew new friends in Congress. the bill kept getting introduced. Over time, it changed. And eventually, we connected with Congressman Fortenberry's office. And I think one of the most important things that happened is that we went from a period where we had these Democratic-led initiatives without any Republicans. It was just hard to overcome that, to what Congressman Fortenberry really brought to the mix was a bipartisan approach. And really can't emphasize how important that's been on the toughest issue in DC. I mean, the most polarizing issue. We did all this in a bipartisan basis with a spectrum of allies that you wouldn't believe. And so that's ultimately, how we got to where we are.
I think that is a perfect segue to get us over to Andy. And I absolutely want to just express, for folks who might not work inside Washington, how hard it must have been to push this rock uphill. You've mentioned the fact that bipartisanship was a key factor to success, that this is the hardest, one of the hardest issues that you can work on in Washington, that, investing at the people-to-people level, also not the most popular thing in Congress these days either. So to get this win when the winds of Washington were blowing so hard against those things is really just something that I think deserves a lot of study and recognition, so that as we move forward, we can have successes like these again. So Andy, I want to turn to you in terms of what it was like on the inside, so to speak, from your perspective on the Hill. We know that you put so many hours into this, working out the provisions and getting those compromises that lead to bipartisanship. So we'd love you to tell us a little bit about that process, but also how important was it to hear from the grassroots peace builders in the U.S. as well? How important was it to hear from constituents that support these things, like folks that we have on this call, Telos friends and alum, how important was that as a success factor as well?
Well, thank you, Teresa, and I want to say thanks to Telos and to Todd and Greg. Thank you guys for putting this together. Thanks for the work that you do. I have been on the Telos trip before. I'm a Telos alumni, so I know intimately what you guys do, and I'm just really thankful for the work that you do and the friendship that you offer. And also to Kevin and Avi, the work that you guys do is, this doesn't happen without you guys. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Joel Bernald, who has joined us. I met Joel up here, and he captured my imagination in a lot of ways, to be able to think outside the box and to really, as you say, Teresa, work on the inside on some of these things. And also Dr. Ren Archer, who's not with us, he was instrumental in our office as former chief of staff, and has become a mentor and good friend. He has orchestrated much of what you see in this final product. I had my journey to Capitol Hill is a little bit strange. I didn't graduate with a political science degree, and I didn't come up here to be a lawyer or a chief of staff for that matter. I had 500 acres in Durango, Colorado for a youth camp. And I ran that for 15 years. That we actually had invited people of multi-faith. It was kind of a multi-faith thing. We had Muslims and Christians and Jews who came. And I stumbled into this Palestinian Israeli sort of thing with the kids who came to my camp. And so I saw relationship building happen on a ground level. In fact, the media came and did stories on us, and they said we were called the jet ski diplomacy place, where we had Gulf State Muslims and Israeli Jews and Kansas Christians all having fun on the back of a jet ski together. And this must be a new way to do life. And so that trained me early to think about, how do we see this problem that we call Israel-Palestine in a new dynamic and in a new way that maybe the think tanks here in Washington haven't poked on here before. And so, long story really short, my meeting with Congressman Fortenberry early on, we shared common values of relationship building. And unfortunately, in Washington, if you have a problem, the answer is a lot of times just throw money at it and we'll fix it. And it just doesn't work. Of course, you have to have money and resources to fuel an engine, but without the foundation of relationship between people, then what are we doing? We're just architecting some ethos that people don't really understand and they don't really have buy-in to. And so when this idea that Allmap brought to the table, and we cross-sectioned, this became what the congressman often calls as a foundation. Every road, he says, every road needs a foundation, and this is a foundation that provides for an architecture where a solid road can be built for the future of peace in the region, which, you know, is my understanding and from my perspective is the epicenter of peace in the world. And so so to get involved in this, and then to see what the roadblocks and the landmines are in Washington, about how pushing a rock uphill. No, it was like pushing a string uphill. I mean, this thing, Avi, the work you guys did before I even joined, I mean, it's just amazing. So the conversations in a bipartisan way were important. When I got involved, I guess 2 Congresses ago, they made it very clear we didn't want to jump, you know, one side over another, because it's important that we bring all together in a bipartisan way to make sure that we get it through. The congressman often has coached me. He said, you can have the greatest idea in the world. We call that policy. It's 10,000 bills going to enter Congress this year, and 99% of them aren't going to go anywhere. I mean, there's a reason why they say it takes an act of Congress to get something done. I mean, like, it's impossible. And then once you have the idea, if it's a good idea, then you have to work the process of how do you get it through the system. And as I was mentioning before, the congressman told me when he got elected to Congress, you know, he thought he made it. You know, you made it. He was here. He was Mr. Congressman. And then you give your first speech, and it's like, I made it. And you quickly realize nobody cares. Nobody listens. And then you drop your first bill, and I've made it. And then you got to get it to committee, and then you got to get to the House, and then you got to get to the Senate, then you got to get to the president, and then we actually architect the work that is appropriated in the bill. So you have to have all those things sort of coalescing together. The idea or the policy meets the process or what actually moves through Capitol Hill through Congress. And then you have to have the constituency to answer. This is a long way to answer your question, Teresa. If you don't have people at the back, and Avi mentioned this before, if you don't have people behind you, then, you know, the congressman often says, if you think you're a leader and you look behind you, nobody's there, you're just out taking a walk. So if you don't have somebody behind you to help you or to push you, then there's no dynamic force really to push anybody to do anything else or to garner attention anyway. Because let's be honest, this is the hardest problem in the world, and it's been going on for a long time now. And to spark a reimagination or a rejuvenation or a different way, it's incredibly difficult.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thanks for bringing attention to the fact that Joel did join us. So glad to hear that he's on the call. And Joel, just huge congratulations to you, and shout out for all the groundwork laying, all the shoe leather advocacy that you did on this thing to really get us to where we are here. So thanks so much for joining. I see your chat, and thanks. So I guess, and Andy, thank you so much for laying it out in terms of what that process looked like on the Hill. Kevin or Avi, I do want to ask, okay, so now we've talked a little bit about how the success actually happened, but what does the bill do? And since, you know, why is it important that it passed? And maybe if we can break it down for folks who might not be familiar with with Washington or with policy, why is it important, and how will it really affect reality on the ground?
Do you want me to go, or how about I'll start and then I'll kick it to you, Avi. All right, good. So the bill, as we keep referring to it, or we affectionately call it MEPA for short, is called the Nita M. Lowy Middle East Partnership for Peace Act. And it's a ground, I really do mean this. I have, particularly having worked on this issue for quite many years, it is very groundbreaking in terms of what it actually does. And I think to kind of give you the reason why, I'm going to give you a couple numbers just to show you what we're talking about. So right now, currently in the United States, we invest about $5 million a year, and that's over the last 4 years. At its height, it was about $13-14 million a year in peace building activities in Israel and Palestine. So just to give you that number, that has since dropped over the last 4 years to 5 million, and only within the shared society sector. So the cross-border sector doesn't get any US dollars. And we are the largest donor to the sector right now as well, more than any other nation around the world, and more than private philanthropy, just to give some idea. The MEPA invests $250 million over 5 years in economic development activities in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as peace building and reconciliation work throughout the region. And that's $50 million a year over 5 years being run out of the United States vis-a-vis the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the Development Finance Corporation. This is really, really important because, as I said earlier, the United States believes in this work, and even USA put out a report in July of 2019 that talked about the need to scale these programs up. They essentially said, we've done an analysis on our what we call CMM for short, the Office of Conflict Management and Mitigation, the work that they are doing in the region. And what we found is that, one, this work changes hearts and minds. It changes the attitudes on the ground. Two, it's successful. And three, there's not enough being done. And that was kind of that was the U.S. government's conclusion on this. And so MEPA actively takes that analysis and works to scale up the program. So what does the bill actually do in practical terms? It's broken down into two different components, as I said. Economic development, specifically investing in small and medium Palestinian businesses in the West Bank with the specific goal of strengthening the Palestinian economy, and doing peace building and reconciliation work within Israel and within Palestine itself. So focusing in on Israel and Palestine on the peace building sector side, what this does is it invests that money into the two different sectors I told you about, both shared society as well as cross-border, with the idea of trying to create the most impact on the ground towards a peaceful situation. For the economic development component of it, it's specifically designed to take Palestinian businesses that are interested in doing this, specifically small and medium, and give them the collateral, give them the ability, give them the technical expertise necessary to expand their businesses, while at the same time providing opportunities to partner with other companies from around the world, be it companies in Israel, be it companies in the United States, Europe, et cetera, et cetera. It's really that idea of the two of scaling up the economy. But I think what's critically different about this bill versus other bills that are out there, and for one, it's the first real peace building bill that affects both societies in a positive way in over 30 years. It's really quite a remarkable feat that it was passed, and it was passed in a bipartisan, bicameral way. It's really amazing on that end. But on the people to people side, one thing that makes it very unique is that it has what we call a board of advisors. And this board of advisors is a group of, Democrat and Republican appointed folks to give advice to the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, on how to best do this programming. But critically important is that in addition to those seats, there are seats for international states or international actors to participate in this. And there's a very distinct reason to do this. And the reason is that the bill talks about the need for the United States not to go alone about this, that the idea that the United States has to build a coalition around the world to really try to change the dynamics on the ground in Israel, Palestine, and they can't do that alone. And so it constantly talks about this need and this necessity for I don't want to say for bringing other nations along. And so those two board seats on the advisory board are specifically designed to bring other voices into here, vis-a-vis either, as Avi was talking about, and what we hope to create eventually, the International Fund, and getting representatives from the International Fund onside this board, or even others out there, other nations, be the UK, the EU, just getting them more engaged and involved in this. And then critically also important is that this idea of allowing other nations to pool their money with USA, but also this idea of finding a way to try to figure out if USA can participate in something else going forward. That is what this bill is designed to do, and designed to kind of raise up. It's designed to kind of give this idea that peace building is not just a US interest, that it is important for the United States to leverage this into something greater. And that's what we hope both Congress and the administration does going forward. So that's kind of like when we're talking about the nuts and bolts of the bill, that's what it is. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, when I talk about it, I talk about it in two separate lenses. But in reality, it will be most likely set up in a much more coordinated fashion, that the U.S. Agency for International Development and the DFC, that in the bill itself, there is a coordination role that State Department has to play, that they have to work together, they have to talk to each other. And I think this is something that both Allmap and others, I know Mr. Fortenberry feels this way as well, that this is so critical that the economic development component and the people-to-people component have to work together to produce the most impact and have the best results. I don't know, Avi, if you want to add anything else to that mix.
Yeah, I mean, if I can, I would say, well, I'll say something that I shared with ALLMEP's board of directors a few days ago, which was, as we're celebrating MEPA and the huge advance that it is, and again, this is the single biggest investment that any country has ever made in this work by multiples. So this is a huge step forward. As Andy was relating before, though, this is a step along the way. The implementation, how you take this legislation and then do something with it, is a huge effort. And we put forward this idea of an international fund for real reasons. It's not just scale, although scale is a part of it. And Kevin threw out some numbers. Here are a couple more. The international community has spent $1.50 per Israeli and Palestinian on peace building per year. Okay, we and our allies spent $44 per person in Northern Ireland over 30 years per year. So $1.50 versus $44. You get what you pay for. So the scale piece is huge, and the US taking a lead foot forward on this is massive. For many years, we would go to the Hill and we'd go to the administration and we'd talk to people in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and on the House side, and we'd say, you guys should, pass this bill. And they'd say, well, the administration is leading foreign policy. They're working on a peace process. We're going to defer to them. And they deferred and they deferred and they deferred. And I think leaders like Congressman Fortenberry and Congresswoman Lowy and their colleagues in the Senate got tired of deferring, and they said, we need to finally invest in this. And so they created a bill that says, we're going, people. And it provides the money to USAID and the DFC, as Kevin indicated. But it also has this call for international collaboration. It has this call for international funding. And I would argue there's a way to get there. And so we're weighing in with everybody now to say, let's have a donor conference. Let's see, no matter whether you see this as a US effort with international contributions or you see this as an international fund, there's an international component. So let's have a meeting with our allies before we set something up and take a path. Let's see where our allies are. We already have the United Kingdom on record interested. We've got people interested in other EU countries. We think there's a way to build on the Abraham Accords to work with Gulf countries to be involved in this. So there's a real moment and window of opportunity to do that. As an aside, I'm definitely biased toward the international fund approach, because you set up an institution and you let it do its work every day. It doesn't depend on whether the diplomacy looks like it's going to be a good day or a bad day. You're still working on the ground because there's someone who has that job. And they have the resources and they have the legitimacy. One of the things that the IFI brought was, because they had donors who were friends of the Palestinians and friends of Israel, when you hit the street and you tried to fund programs, everybody felt like they could be comfortable getting involved. Right now, the US has some work to do to repair relations with the Palestinians, for example. And some countries in Europe have some work to do to repair relations with Israel. Well, if everybody's around the table, then you can do this work and you have credibility on the ground and you have the expertise in one place. There are a million reasons, but the implementation is a huge piece right now. And obviously an incoming administration is going to be looking at this to figure out how they'd like to go forward with it.
Absolutely. And I think implementation is a perfect topic to touch on before we go to Q&A with everybody. So last question for the panel, and I'd like each of you to address it. I want to make sure that everybody on the call feels like there's still ways to engage in this work, that as we face implementation, that supporting it at the grassroots level is still very, very important, and that folks who have been on Telos trips or are Telos supporters have opportunities to make sure that the work goes forward as we move into implementation phase. So what is the most important way that we can do that here in the middle of a pandemic, via Zoom and the limitations that we have currently? But I would like to ask that from each of you. And I realize also the surprise question, so thank you for jumping in.
From my perspective, it goes back to constituency. It's kind of thought as a waste of time to just call your congressman. But what I learned pretty quickly up here on the Hill is that each office has dedicated staff that are taking down these messages and these concerns, and each office has a different threshold, let's say, where when a certain message reaches threshold, it goes straight to the member. And so at this juncture, I monitor those things pretty daily. I've got 3 people that are working on this full time for people from the 1st District of Nebraska. And so if you call your congressman and voice your concern, and we actually have a constituency of us that are continuing to sort of shepherd this through Congress, one one of the things you guys talked about the implementation of the advocacy board is that it's one of those things that doesn't change with administrations. That's the beauty of the board, is that you have this consistent bipartisan board that is nominating people to be on it and move these things without the fluctuation of, extreme right or left or up or down or however you want to look at that. So to have those sort of consistent, still waters continuing to move, we need the advocates to call the congressmen and the senators and say that this is an important thing that they want to see happen.
I would +1 that as well. I think that, the one of the beauties of this thing is that there was support not only from the field interested in this, but we saw so many different individuals and so many different organizations continuously getting involved and calling their member of Congress and advocating to their senators to be involved. And so what I would suggest, even though as I tell our staff and I tell Avi and the board is that, we got the bill signed into law, which is a feat in itself, but the hardest role now is actually the implementation process and making sure that it's implemented in a way that is actually what was intended. And that's going to require consistent pressure by grassroots, grass tops organizations to keep calling their member of Congress, to keep advocating for this idea of peace building and why it's so critical and why this idea of bringing in more nations is just so important to the process. So I would +1 everything Andy says, that it's not just about the phone calls, it's about emails, it's about creating those relationships, it's about engaging, and I'll put my working with Telos and other organizations that you all might be involved with, either Telos, or if you're Jewish, the Federation System, or AIPAC, or the Progressive Israel Network, whatever. Pick your poison, as I like to say, because almost everyone does support this effort. But I think it's important to keep pushing that through and telling your members and to your senators that this is important for you as a constituent of their district or of their state.
In addition to echoing what Andy and Kevin said, I'll add, of course, we're going to have annual budget pushes to make sure that the money that was authorized is actually appropriated each year, year after year. And even though under the law, the program can't even be established for 12 months after enactment, there are going to be people in Congress who say, it's been 12 months, show me the impact. They haven't even had a chance to do a thing yet. So there's going to be a continuing push to support this and make sure it has a fair shot, at doing its thing. But to zoom out a little bit, I would say for people who are plugged into Telos, I think you've already taken the right step, right? You've plugged in to a network and a group of people who care about solutions, not just continuing the problems, and spread the good word. We have all lived through how terrible social media and sort of the worst aspects of our modern society can propagate divisions and hatred and things of that sort. Well, the members of Allmap who are working on the ground and eventually will be able to implement these programs that MEPA is going to support, they have the other side of the story. They're doing incredible work. They're doing God's work. And so I feel like we all have a duty to spread those good stories so that more people will know about them and support them. I cannot tell you, I'm not surprised anymore, but it's amazing how many people I meet who have no idea that there are Israelis and Palestinians working together at all in any way. So we have a lot of work to do to spread the good word.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, all of you, for your insights there. David, if we want to go over to questions from the audience, that would be perfect.
Absolutely. I have seen a number of questions from Wassam. If you would like to ask your questions directly, feel free to unmute.
Thank you very much, guys. Great listening to you. Greetings from Palestine here. I'm home with the kids, so excuse the background noise. Can you hear me okay?
Great.
Yep, we can hear you.
Great. No, look, I admire the courage and the initiative that it takes to move against such challenging forces. And for me, the time that I've spent here over the past 15 years, I've met many of your colleagues as well, is that there's an elephant in the room that I think we sometimes overlook, and it is those that have, unfortunately, an interest in the conflict continuing, an interest in things continuing to be maintained in the dynamics that they are, because it allows them to maintain monopolies over, for example, Dead Sea natural resources or natural gas in the Mediterranean. And I mean, these powerful interests are not unique to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is the corporate interest and family interests that drive inequality in American society are very similar to those that drive conflict as well. And I think it's important to keep these things in mind, and especially seeing how there's been, I think, a corrosive effect on American society through the foreign policy, because it becomes one of those, really difficult questions to reconcile when Trump is considered the best U.S. president in history for Israel, but one of the worst presidents in U.S. history for Americans. And then how does that reconcile with the clear base of support that espouses anti-Semitism from the Capitol riots? And these all things are very are elements that I think need to be reconciled to address this issue in a very genuine manner. And so my question, obviously this is not an easy one, but how do you see addressing this kind of elephant in the room, where you know that there are those that have a keen interest in ensuring that things continue in a very inequitable manner, because that ensures more control, more profit for an elite few?
I think there's definitely a lot there. Does anybody, would anybody like to take a shot?
I'll offer two thoughts. One, I think a lot of the premise of the work that we do, especially as we talk about going to scale, the premise is that there are a lot more people that are not participating in the process and having their voices heard, because they just don't believe that that silent majority, as we've called them for a long time, however many there are, they don't believe that they can actually win the day in terms of policies and so forth, and the partnership and all of that. So we're trying to empower people who are interested in real solutions to the challenges that Israelis and Palestinians are facing. The second thing I'll say is, I don't know if this was implicit in your question, but sometimes we get this question about, well, aren't you just sharing hummus and talking about things, but you're not actually talking about the difficult political situation? And I would say, actually, the kinds of programs that the organizations we support are involved in are actually the only places where people are really coming together to talk about difficult political challenges and differences. Everyone else is just in their echo chambers, fighting it out over Twitter. So it's not in any way divorced from that. It's very much a part of the conversation and a part of the new relationships people are building to have constructive, productive engagement. So get enough of those people together, and you could see some real change in the big picture.
I think that's helpful, Avi. And I do want to address one question that's in the chat that I think we can answer really quickly and be really helpful. Where can the average person find more information about MEPA?
So you can find it on the ALLMEP website here. I'll put in a link to our blog post that we put out about this, which includes statements from members from Mr. Fortenberry's office, Ms. Lowy's office, as well as others that came out in support of the bill. But I'll put that in the chat for everyone to look at.
Wonderful, thank you. And as we move kind of through into the next phase of implementation, will the website continuously be updated in ways that members can engage?
Absolutely.
Great. So visit often, folks, if you're interested. I do also want to come back to this question that's in the chat from Ben. I think he asked a really important question about the political threats that that members of Congress or other politicians around the world face when coming out on these issues that can be rather divisive. I think maybe, Andy, that's a good question for you because obviously Representative Fortenberry,
give me the easy one.
You know, these are all easy questions. These topics, just easy stuff. And how can we make it that members of Congress feel supported when they do take risks politically to support this kind of work?
I mean, it gets back to the constituency issue we've already talked about. Again, if you have people behind you and you have a wind behind you, it's easier. I mean, I think before I came to Congress, I thought you had these leaders that represent your districts and your states and the country, and they're up there to make decisions. But that's true in one sense, but it's also it's been driven by the constituency. You know, we had an enormous backlog of constituent concerns in our office, and when I took the helm, we whittled that down person to person to person. So my whole staff, I didn't care if you're a foreign affairs person or if you're a banking and finance or science and technology, we got on the phone and we called the first district constituents with us and said, how can we help? And so that was an effort for the office to say, we're not, I mean, the reason we came here was to represent you, not to be here and, you know, some ethereal, whatever politics deal. It's we want to be touched to the people. So I would mirror that. We want to have real, authentic relationship. And that's how you can help congressional members march through very treacherous conversations. Is that if you just give them support and know that, you know, they're doing the work that you want them to be to get done. And so in our office, we have associations that come in all the time and they do the same lobby work and they lay down the same, you know, paperwork and their same year-end report, and everybody's doing great work and everybody wants more money and everybody wants you to be on their thing and whatever. And the congressman's very generous with his time and he's very open to having people come by, but he's also very meticulous about, if you want us to be in relationship, then we're gonna sacrifice together. And that means we'll go to bat for you if you go to bat for us. And it's not a quid pro quo, tit for tat kind of a thing. Congressman is going to do the right. Fortenberry is going to do the right thing regardless. He's just a man of incredible integrity, but he wants to know that you're with him. He wants to know that we're in relationship in this thing together. We don't want another glossy paper to show us what you did. We want to know that you're in the fight with us, and we'll be in the fight with you.
Absolutely. And this concept of kind of co-governing members of Congress with their constituencies is one that I know a lot of people are supporting and pursuing. Right now, we're going to go ahead and say goodbye to Kevin because he needs to jump off. But we do have another. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
And I do apologize.
Expertise.
I do apologize. I have to jump. I'll put my email in the chat for anyone that wants to get a hold of me or has any other additional questions. I do apologize that I have to jump, but again, before I run, I would be remiss to thank Teresa for moderating. And thanks Telos for hosting both Allmap of this, and then also to Andy. Thank the Congressman for everything that you guys have done, and I'm looking forward, as always, to keep working with you and the team over there for as long as we can. So thank you so much. We're excited, and I will see everyone soon.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kevin. And I hope someday when it's safe to travel and be together again, someday in person, we can have some sort of celebration and say hello again.
We hope to soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kevin. And I think, for folks who were at the 1 hour mark, we do have another 15 minutes for Q&A. And I did want to ask another question of both Avi and Andy. We've mentioned this theme a couple of times of this work is very hard. This work is one of the hardest issues to focus on in Congress and in conflict resolution in general. What are the key things, besides the MEPA, of course, that are giving you hope right now?
I'll give you more time to think. I'm sorry, it's hard for me to separate. You said except for MEPA, but it's really hard for me to separate that out. that's a reaffirmation for me, actually, that good people will do the right thing, and they'll work hard for it, and they'll be persistent until it gets done. And I look at the world today, and I think too often we're dealing in sound bites and bumper stickers, or even just tweets, and we're not thinking in those long term. We're not thinking in the broad brushstrokes and how we can make a difference over time. And so, to see something like that happen after so long, I think is something that gives me hope. Politically, of course, there are reasons to have hope. The Abraham Accords give an opportunity, a platform. I mean, it can go in many directions, but it could be a way that the wider Arab world can embrace Israelis and Palestinians both and help support them towards a resolution. The idea that there will be elections in both Israel and Palestine, obviously potential for changes in every direction, but always possible for positive change. I think the new administration is interested in multilateralism and long-term solutions. I mean, some people might be disappointed that they've said that they're not planning to start solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from day one, but I actually think that's a good thing. I'd rather they take it slow. I'd rather they invest in the fundamentals, like implementing MEPA, get that running, and take another shot at that apple when we actually have a better chance of success. So I think that's a positive sign. And the multilateralism, I mean, the idea that we're not doing this alone, that we're going to hopefully bring partners around the table, that will do it in a long-term, strategic, intentional way. All of those are good things, and things we have never done before. I mean, we've been trying to solve this conflict to peace process our way out of it for decades, and we've never tried these things before.
Absolutely. Andy?
I want to go back to what gives me hope. Along with the camp, I started a gap year program where I had students that traveled around the world. And before, it was from their senior year in high school until their sophomore year in college. And so we orchestrated an organization that basically would offer students 900 years of international internship experience before they went to the university. And part of that one chapter, if you will, of this program actually existed in Bethlehem and in Jerusalem. And the hope that I saw with the students was they would spend a certain amount of time, varied on the group, but a certain amount of time with Palestinians. And then they would go over and they'd spend a certain amount of time with settlers, and then they'd share, and they became the link between, and so it was like you had settlers that didn't know that Palestinians existed and vice versa. And they just had this sort of mentality that this is the way it is. This is how I'm supposed to think. This is how I've been trained to think. And then all of a sudden you have these crazy, students that come in that are the key for re-architecting the whole relationship. And so that's maybe the hope that I see in this, in MEPA and Allmap and Telos, is maybe there's still a place for the link to happen, because I think all too often it's a disassociation of relationship. It's a loneliness factor that often will keep us in our separate corners, and we just keep, as Avi said, or maybe it was Kevin talking about echo chambers, just living in our own echo chambers that continue to tell us this is how we're supposed to think. One of the things about MEPA that needs to be celebrated, this is a whole new architecture. This is a whole new way of uniting people and bringing people together, so that when something happens one day, we have a tie, we have a business tie, we have a social tie, we have a relational tie that's brought us together, where we can tamp down whatever the skirmishes are of the day. And maybe, as Avi pointed out, just like in Ireland, the peace holds.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. An interesting question has come up in the chat that I want to bring attention to. And this theme of building coalitions across oceans and making sure that grassroots networks are connected globally, I think is an extremely important one. And Brian has asked, in the world of coalition building, how has Allmap, so I guess this question is for you, Avi, how has Allmap overcome organizational rivalries and motivated organizations to set aside individual goals and join a larger coalition? I think that anybody who's worked in the coalition building space knows that that's very much a reality sometimes, even if it's uncomfortable to talk about or to mention. But particularly in the world where there is limited resources and access to funding, how can organizations be motivated to come together and work on united policy goals?
So I'm going to take that question as if directed about the different members of ALLMEP working together in the coalition.
I believe so, yes.
Okay. That was kind of the funny thing when I started working with some of these groups is I would set up meetings and meet with them, and they tell me about what they do. And they had been so accustomed to having to explain how they had the answer, and what they were doing, the very specific niche solution they had, kids between the ages of 8 and 10 who play soccer together on Tuesdays, that's the answer. And anybody who's doing it on Wednesdays or doing it with older people, waste of time. I mean, it's nice, but it's a waste of time. That's, I had that meeting with almost every organization I met with at the beginning, and I tried and worked hard. And I think over time we managed to get there to explain to them that, to me as an outsider to all of this work, all of them together, they all blur together and they occupy the space of the head of a pin. I mean, in terms of the big world out there. And they had so much to gain from being connected and working together. And I mean, we went through some long, interminable meetings, try to hash out how you actually cooperate and share information. And, we just a couple months ago, Allmap had a huge fundraising gala, virtual gala, our first one actually in all these years. And our member organizations, it was to highlight and spotlight them, and they participated in that. And the money was going to Allmap so that we could plow it back into the field. The trust building that occurred over so many years so that an organization would be willing to promote that and to spend its time and attach its name and say, give money to this other thing because it's going to help all of us. That took a long time. Success doesn't hurt. I think pretty early on, we were working with the Congress to promote and grow the annual funding that the U.S. has provided over the years. And the fact that that money was flowing and the fact that they were connecting with the officials who were making it happen gave them a reason to participate. But over time, they found that the CEO of one group is sitting next to the CEO of the other, and they realized that they have more in common than divides them, and actually they could get a lot done if they work together, compare notes, and cooperate.
Absolutely, thank you so much. Greg, I actually want to turn it over to you for just a moment to bring up the question that you just raised in the chat. I think that is it. There is an important conversation to be had there. If you want to just jump in real quick.
Sure. Well, welcome, Avi and also Andy. Great to have you guys here. I've been getting a lot of messages and texts about sort of the reality on the ground, the structural differences between Israelis and Palestinians. The idea that, obviously there needs to be a relational basis there, but these are not two equal parties. There's one party that, at least with respect to Palestinians, has control over the other party's daily lives. And there's one party that's paying the price in terms of really limited opportunity and ability to just live out their daily lives. And so I guess the question comes back to, what is there a relationship between MEPA and sort of this structural challenge that Palestinians live under Israeli occupation, whether they're in the West Bank or Gaza Strip, and are not equal to Israelis in other four? Like, how do you deal with the structural aspect of this as opposed just to sort of the people-to-people aspect? Where do these pieces fit?
Another easy one. You're being silent, right? You're giving me this one.
I mean, that's why you get paid the big bucks.
Yeah, just big bucks. Structural issues. I mean, if we look at the current climate in America and the same sort of similar structural issues that we're trying to emerge out of, And we're seeing the social classes trying to find a way to massage this inequality at some level. Again, it's expounded. I mean, it's exponentially worse, right? Right in what you're talking about, Greg. But I think we can use that as a roadmap, so to speak, to understand that there's not going to be a switch that's flipped overnight that says, okay, now we've passed legislation. Now it's all going to be good. We're all going to sing Kumbaya and have a fire out at the campsite. This is going to take long work, and it's going to take a lot of risk. It's going to take risk for people on both sides to be able to come and risk their own reputations, their own abilities to give to the other, to know the other, to be known by the other. And I think that's where we're at the rub of starting this fund off, is trying to figure out how do we do that in a systematic way that builds, again, I like to use the word architecture, that we build the architecture that then is allowed to flourish on its own. Because I don't think anywhere here in Congress, at least from our office, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think anybody here in Congress wants to just, tell people what to do all the time. Do we? At least not on our side. So I think as we build this, the hope is to breathe life into the ability for people to find self-determination, understand how to live their life, and live their life with the other, whoever the other is at that juncture.
Can I also add, because I'm only adding because I thought that was spot on. I think that what's really thoughtful about MEPA is that it's tangible, and this is reflective of the work that is taking place on the ground. Like I said earlier, it's not just talk. It's not just let's do kumbaya. It's based in actual cooperation. It's based in the delivery of services that people benefit from in their daily lives, whether it's a school or it's an environmental project that cleans up the pollution, or it's a health clinic. It's tangible. And so it gives people a reason and an opportunity to engage with each other based around something, not just talk. And it's the place where people are actually meeting so that they can talk about, on top of those, tangible things, they can talk about those imbalances and their different experiences, which, there are a lot of people who advocate for not talking to the other side. That's their solution. We're just going to wait them out, or we're going to win, or whatever it is. I'm not someone who happens to believe that that's going to work for either side. I think that the engagement is the critical piece of this, and MEPA sort of binds that all together. The economic piece, it's not an accident. The economic piece is heavily focused on developing the Palestinian economy. Yes, in partnership. Yes, in ways that promote reconciliation, but it's not investing in Tel Aviv. I mean, it's investing in the West Bank, and that's for a reason, because it's hopefully improving those inequalities a little bit and giving people a real tangible basis to talk about, where they're coming from and what their experiences have been.
I think it's so important that we ended up on that point, because this question of how do we also pursue justice while working towards peace are questions that the whole world over is grappling with right now. And to learn that that's really built in to the work itself is extremely encouraging. Everybody, we are at time. Avi and Andy and Joel and Kevin, thank you for giving us hope. Thank you for giving us inspiration. Thank you for giving us our marching orders in terms of how we continue forward and how the work is just beginning, even though we've already done so much and had this incredible success. So please go ahead, everybody, and go on the Telos website, go on the Allmap website, learn more as you can, and continue to engage as we move forward in this new era in a lot of ways. Avi and Andy, any final last words?
Thank you so much for all the work you do. Thank you, Avi. Thank you, Teresa. Thank you to Greg and to Todd and to Joel. Appreciate you guys so very much.
Wonderful.
I mean, took the words right out of my mouth. Thank you. Thank you to this great group of longtime friends. Really so cool to be with you, and looking forward to working together, because there's a lot more work to do.
Onward. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day.